300,000. That was the total number of drones Ukraine managed to produce in all of 2023, the entire year. 300,000 units from a country actively absorbing a full-scale military invasion. Now hold that number. By 2025, according to the Kyiv Independent, that figure had reached 4.5 million in a single year. Let that sink in for a moment. We are not talking about incremental industrial growth. We are talking about a 15-fold expansion of drone manufacturing capacity built not in peacetime laboratories, but under active conflict conditions, funded in part by a state accelerator program called Brave One, launched in April of 2023. And here is the number that should reframe everything you think you know about this conflict. Ukraine's deputy defense minister told NATO's operational framework that the country is targeting 7 million drones in 2026 alone. 7 million. Most coverage stops here. Most analysis treats this as a headline about battlefield dominance. Ukraine produces more. Ukraine hits more targets. That is the wrong lens entirely. In this video, I am going to give you a different framework, not a story about who is winning, a structural analysis of how mass drone deployment has created a specific choke point in offensive military strategy, one that neither side has fully solved, and why the economic logic of that choke point reaches far beyond the front lines. Because what is happening in eastern Ukraine right now is not just a weapons story. It is a cost structure story, and cost structure always wins in the long run. Before we go deeper, let us establish the foundation. Because in geopolitical analysis, the most dangerous thing you can do is build an argument on numbers that cannot hold weight under scrutiny. So let us lay the receipts on the table clearly, precisely, and with every source labeled for exactly what it is. But first, the industrial baseline. The Kyiv Institute for the World Economy, one of the most cited independent trackers of conflict-related aid flows, documents that Ukraine has received approximately 316.7 billion euros in allocated support from Western partners over the past 4 years. That is not battlefield propaganda. That is audited financial data from a German academic institution with no stake in the outcome of this war. Second, the production trajectory. The Kyiv Independent, a Ukrainian outlet, and that label matters, reports that drone output rose from 300,000 units in 2023 to 4.5 million in 2025. This is a Ukrainian source reporting on Ukrainian government data. We use it as a declared figure, not as independently verified industrial census data. The distinction is important. Third, the institutional architecture behind that growth. In April of 2023, Ukraine launched Brave One, a fully state-owned program designed to channel government grants directly to private drone developers and defense startups. One of its early beneficiaries, an artificial intelligence drone company called Swarmer, subsequently listed on the NASDAQ. That listing is a matter of public financial record. You can look it up. It is not a claim, it is a filing. Fourth, the self-reliance shift. Ukraine's Ministry of Defense announced in February of 2026 that domestic production now accounts for 82% of weapons and equipment purchased by its defense procurement agency. 1 year prior, that figure stood at 46%. These are official government figures from a party directly involved in the conflict. They should be treated as declared positions, not ground truth, but the directional shift they represent is consistent with the investment patterns we can observe independently through defense industry reporting. Now, here is where the historical pattern becomes relevant. If you track asymmetric conflicts over the past 5 decades, from the Soviet experience in Afghanistan in the 1980s to the American encounter with improvised explosive devices in Iraq in the 2000s, a consistent structural dynamic emerges. When one side finds a low-cost weapons system that imposes disproportionately high costs on the opposing side's conventional assets, the conflict enters what strategists call an attrition asymmetry phase. The specific weapon changes. The logic does not. IEDs did not defeat American armor through superior technology. They defeated it through cost imposition. Each device cost hundreds of dollars. Each armored vehicle it disabled cost millions. The math, sustained long enough, becomes strategically decisive. FPV drones occupy a structurally analogous position in this conflict. The unit economics are not identical, but the underlying logic of cheap offense against expensive defense is the same pattern, wearing a different uniform. This is not an argument that Ukraine is winning. This is an argument that a specific cost structure has emerged, and that cost structure is now the central variable in how this conflict evolves. But here's what that framing reveals that most battlefield analysis completely misses. The real question is not how many drones Ukraine can produce. The real question is what happens to Russia's offensive doctrine when the cost of forward movement becomes structurally prohibitive. And that answer lives in a concept that military planners call a choke point, and it is far more consequential than anything happening on the surface of this conflict. That is exactly where we are going next. Let us define the term precisely before we use it. A choke point in strategic analysis is not simply a difficult position. It is a structural condition in which one party is forced to expend resources at a rate that is disproportionate to the tactical gain achieved. The choke point does not have to stop movement entirely. It only has to make movement expensive enough that sustaining it becomes a systemic problem. With that definition in place, let us look at what mass FPV deployment has actually created. Prior to the large-scale introduction of drone warfare in this conflict, Russian offensive doctrine operated on a relatively conventional logic. Concentrate forces, apply artillery preparation, push armored columns through weakened defensive lines, accept casualties as a function of territorial gain. That calculus assumed a certain cost per kilometer of advance. It was brutal. It was attritional. But it was legible, meaning military planners could model it, sustain it, and justify it to political leadership. Mass FPV deployment breaks that legibility. Here is why. FPV drones do not simply inflict casualties. They restructure the cost of every tactical decision made at the squad and platoon level. Moving through open ground becomes a probabilistic calculation rather than a command decision. Taking cover in a structure does not guarantee protection. Documented reporting from outlets, including the Telegraph, has described drone operators navigating units through open windows and confined spaces. Armored vehicles, which historically absorbed small arms fire and provided meaningful protection, become high-value targets for drone strikes costing a fraction of the vehicle's replacement value. The result is a compression of operational tempo. Advances that might previously have taken hours now require significantly longer coordination, more reconnaissance, and greater logistical exposure. And every additional hour of exposure is an additional hour of drone coverage. This is the choke point, not a line on a map. A multiplication of cost applied to every meter of forward movement. Let us put approximate numbers to this, with an important caveat. Precise unit cost data for military drone production is not publicly verified at an auditable level. What follows is analytical estimation based on open-source defense reporting, not confirmed procurement data. FPV drones used by Ukraine are estimated by multiple defense analysts to cost somewhere between a few hundred and $1,000 per unit, depending on payload and guidance system. Counter-drone electronic warfare systems, the primary defensive response available to Russian forces, range from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of dollars per installation, with ongoing operational costs. The strategic implication, as analysts at several independent defense research institutions have noted, is that the cost ratio between the attacking instrument and the defensive response is severely inverted. A defending force that must deploy expensive electronic warfare assets to neutralize inexpensive attacking drones is engaged in a resource exchange that, sustained over months and years, becomes fiscally corrosive. Think about what that means structurally. Russia is not simply absorbing tactical losses. It is potentially being drawn into a resource allocation spiral where the defense of conventional assets requires investment that compounds faster than those assets can be replaced or repositioned. Here is where intellectual honesty requires us to slow down. Russia is not a passive actor in this dynamic, and any analysis that treats it as one is not analysis, it is advocacy. Moscow has been expanding its own drone production capacity, including scaled manufacturing of Shahed series drones and domestic variants developed under significant investment pressure. Russian electronic warfare capabilities, jamming systems, signal disruption, GPS spoofing are among the most developed in the world by independent military assessment. There is documented evidence that Ukrainian FPV operators face significant signal interference in certain contested areas, which degrades targeting precision and operational range. Independent defense analysts, including those at the Royal United Services Institute in London, have consistently cautioned against linear extrapolation of drone effectiveness. Tactical adaptations occur. Defenders adjust. The history of military technology is not a story of permanent advantage. It is a story of measure and countermeasure cycling at increasing speed. There is also a supply chain vulnerability on the Ukrainian side that receives insufficient attention. FPV drone production at scale requires a continuous supply of microprocessors, image sensors, and signal components, the majority of which are not produced domestically in Ukraine. They move through international procurement networks that remain exposed to diplomatic pressure, sanctions architecture, and export control decisions made in Washington, Brussels, and Taipei. A disruption to that component flow would not show up immediately on the battlefield. It would show up 3 to 6 months later in production shortfalls. That lag makes it an invisible vulnerability, which is precisely what makes it strategically significant. Now, here is the layer of this analysis that most commentary skips entirely because it requires looking at the conflict not as a military event, but as an industrial competition. Brave One, Ukraine's state-backed defense accelerator, represents something genuinely novel in modern conflict financing. By channeling relatively modest seed grants, the Swarmer investment was documented at $48,000 into private companies that then attract venture capital and public market financing. Ukraine effectively converted military necessity into a self-reinforcing industrial ecosystem. The Kyiv School of Economics assessed Ukraine's defense sector at $6.8 billion in current value, 6 times its pre-invasion valuation. That is not a military statistic. That is an economic transformation occurring inside an active conflict zone. When you observe this pattern through the lens of historical industrial mobilization, the American manufacturing pivot of 1941, the Soviet industrial relocation east of the Urals during the same period, what you see is not an anomaly. You see a recurring dynamic where existential pressure produces industrial acceleration that outlasts the conflict itself. The drones being built today are not just battlefield instruments. They are the foundation of a post-war export industry, an investment thesis, and a geopolitical asset. And that is the dimension of this story that neither a battlefield map nor a casualty count can capture. But here is the question that should be sitting uncomfortably in the back of your mind right now. If this cost structure is as significant as the data suggests, if mass FPV deployment is genuinely restructuring the economics of offensive warfare, then why does this conflict continue to grind forward at the pace we observe? The answer to that question does not live on the battlefield. It lives in your energy bill, in the price of grain at your local market, in the interest rate decision sitting on a central banker's desk somewhere in Frankfurt or Washington. And that is exactly where we are going next. Here is the part that most geopolitical commentary never reaches, because it is easier to talk about drones and front lines than it is to trace the precise mechanism by which a decision made in a command center in eastern Ukraine travels through 6 layers of global economic infrastructure and arrives quietly in your monthly household budget. But that transmission mechanism is real, and it is operating right now. Prolonged conflict in the Black Sea and Eastern European corridor does not just create humanitarian consequences. It creates sustained pricing pressure on global energy markets. Ukraine and Russia together represent a significant share of European natural gas transit infrastructure. That infrastructure has been progressively disrupted since 2022. The knock-on effect is not theoretical. European energy prices have demonstrated sustained elevation relative to pre-conflict baselines, a pattern documented by the International Energy Agency across multiple quarterly reports. Elevated energy costs are not contained within European borders. They transmit globally through shipping costs, manufacturing input prices, and cold chain logistics. Every container moved by a diesel-powered vessel, every factory running on gas-derived electricity, every refrigerated truck delivering goods to a supermarket, all of them absorb a fraction of that energy price elevation. That fraction, multiplied across billions of transactions, is what economists call imported inflation. And imported inflation does not announce itself. It arrives silently, embedded in the price of goods that have no visible connection to any conflict zone. This is what it means when analysts say that the cost structure of this war is not contained to the battlefield. Ukraine and Russia are not peripheral players in global agricultural markets. Prior to the full-scale conflict escalation in 2022, Ukraine alone accounted for a substantial share of global wheat and sunflower oil exports. Russia remains one of the world's largest fertilizer exporters. Disruption to Ukrainian agricultural export corridors, even partially mitigated by diplomatic arrangements like the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which itself experienced significant instability, has introduced structural volatility into global food commodity pricing. For populations in Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and sub-Saharan Africa, where food expenditure represents a disproportionately large share of household income, this volatility is not an abstraction. It is a direct compression of purchasing power. For a household in Hanoi or Jakarta, the connection between a drone war in Eastern Europe and the price of cooking oil or bread flour is not obvious. But the supply chain draws a straight line between them, and that line runs through commodity futures markets, shipping insurance premiums, and agricultural input costs that are all sensitive to the same conflict dynamics. Here is where the butterfly effect reaches into fiscal policy in ways that have direct consequences for public services. The sustained nature of this conflict has accelerated a broad reassessment of defense spending commitments across NATO member states and beyond. Multiple European governments have moved toward or exceeded the 2% of GDP defense spending threshold that NATO has long recommended, but rarely enforced. Defense spending reallocation is not free. Every additional euro directed toward military procurement is a euro not available for healthcare infrastructure, education funding, or social welfare programs. This is not a political argument for or against defense investment. It is a straightforward fiscal accounting observation. The IMF and World Bank have both flagged in published assessments that the sustained defense spending increases triggered in part by the European security environment are creating medium-term fiscal pressure in economies that are simultaneously managing post-pandemic debt levels and elevated interest rate environments. The citizens absorbing that pressure are not soldiers. They are taxpayers in countries that are not party to the conflict. There is a quieter economic consequence that receives almost no mainstream coverage. As Ukraine's drone manufacturing sector attracts increasing interest from European and Middle Eastern defense investors, a trend documented in defense industry reporting throughout 2025 and 2026 capital is being redirected away from conventional investment channels. Venture capital and institutional money flowing into defense technology startups is money not flowing into consumer technology, green energy transition, or emerging market development. This reorientation of investment priorities, driven substantially by the security environment created by this conflict, has compounding effects on which technologies get developed, which industries receive growth capital, and which regions attract foreign direct investment, over the next decade. These are slow-moving consequences. They do not appear in tomorrow's news cycle. But if you track capital allocation patterns the way you would track a geological shift, measuring not the earthquake, but the slow movement of tectonic plates, the directional signal is clear. None of this means the conflict determines your economic fate unilaterally. What it means is that the feedback loops between a localized military conflict and a globally integrated economic system are more direct, more immediate, and more personal than most people are positioned to recognize. The drone being manufactured in a Kyiv industrial facility today is connected through a chain of pricing mechanisms and capital flows to the cost of your next grocery run, your next mortgage payment, and the public services available in your city next year. That is not fear-mongering. That is the architecture of a globalized economy responding to a structural disruption. And if you think the economic consequences we have traced so far are significant, wait until you see what happens when we examine the one variable that neither side in this conflict has fully accounted for. Because the most consequential move in this entire strategic picture has not happened yet. And when it does, it will not look like a military development. It will look like a market signal. Let me tell you what the dominant narrative gets wrong. Not because the facts are incorrect. The production numbers are real, the investment flows are documented, the battlefield pressure is observable. The dominant narrative gets the interpretation wrong. And in geopolitical analysis, an incorrect interpretation of correct facts is arguably more dangerous than a simple factual error because it is harder to detect and easier to believe. So here is the contrarian position, structured not as provocation, but as analytical discipline. The prevailing framing in Western defense commentary treats Ukraine's drone manufacturing expansion as a pathway to strategic advantage. More drones equal more pressure equal eventual Russian operational collapse. Here is an alternative interpretation that the data also supports. When defensive drone deployment becomes cheap enough and pervasive enough, it does not just raise the cost of Russian offensive movement. It raises the cost of all offensive movement, including Ukrainian counteroffensive operations. A battlefield saturated with FPV drones on both sides does not favor the attacker. It favors the defender, always, because the defender chooses the terrain, has prepared positions, and does not need to move through open ground under observation. If both sides are simultaneously scaling drone production, and Russia is, according to independent defense assessments, then the net effect of drone proliferation may not be Ukrainian breakthrough. It may be mutual deterrence at the tactical level, a freezing of frontline geometry enforced not by negotiation, but by the economics of movement. One way to interpret this situation is that mass drone deployment is not ending this conflict faster. It may be extending it by making decisive offensive action prohibitively expensive for either party. That is a conclusion that serves neither side's preferred narrative, which is precisely why it rarely appears in mainstream analysis. Ukraine's Ministry of Defense has stated that domestic production now accounts for 82% of defense procurement. This has been widely interpreted as evidence of growing strategic autonomy. The supply chain data suggests a more complicated picture. FPV drone manufacturing at scale requires a continuous and reliable supply of specific components, image sensors, flight controllers, signal processors, and microelectronics that are not produced domestically within Ukraine at meaningful volume. These components move through international procurement networks involving manufacturers primarily located in East Asia and distributed through intermediary markets. This means that Ukraine's apparent manufacturing independence is, in structural terms, an assembly independence built on an imported component foundation. The distinction matters enormously because component supply is sensitive to export control decisions, diplomatic pressure, and sanctions architecture in ways that finished weapons transfers are not. A government that wants to constrain Ukrainian military capability without the political visibility of cutting weapons aid has a less visible lever available, and that lever sits inside the semiconductor supply chain. This is not a prediction. It is a structural vulnerability that analytical rigor requires us to name. Here is the observation that I think reframes this entire situation most productively. The drone war visible on the battlefield is the surface layer. Underneath it, a different competition is occurring, one measured not in territorial kilometers, but in institutional capacity, capital allocation, and technological learning curves. Ukraine is building an industrial ecosystem under fire that is historically unprecedented at this scale and speed. But the question of whether that ecosystem becomes a durable strategic asset or a conflict-dependent anomaly depends entirely on variables that have nothing to do with frontline positions. It depends on whether Western capital continues to flow into Ukrainian defense startups after the conflict ends, or whether investors rotate back to less complicated markets the moment a ceasefire is signed. It depends on whether the component supply chains that currently support drone production can be domesticated or secured through long-term procurement agreements. It depends on whether the institutional knowledge accumulated by Ukrainian drone operators and engineers survives the transition from wartime mobilization to peacetime industrial structure. These are the variables that determine whether Ukraine emerges from this conflict with a generational industrial advantage or with a sophisticated military capability that has no post-war economic foundation to stand on. The battlefield tells you who is under pressure today. The supply chain tells you who has leverage tomorrow. And the capital flows tell you who wins the decade. Most analysis picks one of those three timescales and treats it as the whole picture. The honest answer is that we do not yet know which timescale will prove decisive because the conflict is not resolved. The post-war economic architecture has not been determined, and the geopolitical alignments that will shape investment flows are still being negotiated in real time. What we do know is this. The next move in this strategic picture will not be announced by a general. It will be announced by a procurement contract, an export license, or a capital raise in a city far from any front line. And that move may already be in motion. So let us bring this into focus. Ukraine has built a drone manufacturing ecosystem from 300,000 units in 2023 to 4.5 million in 2025 that has structurally altered the cost of offensive movement in this conflict. That is documented. That is real. The economic transmission of that conflict reaches into energy pricing, food commodity markets, and fiscal policy in countries that have no soldiers anywhere near the front lines. That is not speculation. That is supply chain architecture. And the dominant narrative that drone superiority translates cleanly into strategic advantage deserves far more scrutiny than it is currently receiving. Here is the question I will leave you with. When both sides have drones, when both sides have electronic warfare, and when the component supply chains that make all of it possible are controlled by neither combatant who is actually holding the decisive leverage in this conflict, that answer is coming. Subscribe so you do not miss it.